Hello and welcome to the Thursday, August 14th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. This episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Graduate Certificate Program in Purple Team Operation. Yesterday we talked about new Microsoft patches. Sadly, old vulnerabilities appear to be still around, at least around enough for attacks to still take advantage of them. Xavier came across this little bit odd Excel spreadsheet. The extension is .xlam, which usually hints at like a macro file, but macros were not the problem here. Instead, it just exploited an old 2017 vulnerability, the good old equation editor vulnerability. So apparently it's still enough of it around in order for attackers to still give it a try ever so often. As Xavier points out, he keeps an old virtual machine around just for that purpose. I think in most corporate environment, I hope it's not that easy to find these old systems still running, but well, I have been surprised before. The payload here is then essentially just triggering a download of an executable that is being run on the victim's system. And this executable is an information stealer that then exfiltrates data via email directly to an attacker's mail server. Another sort of not super common technique, given that outbound email via random mail service is often blocked. So maybe more something going after home users or the like versus more enterprise users. And talking about vulnerabilities and Microsoft's Patch Tuesday, there's one quick add-on here that I didn't point out yesterday, and that's that the one already publicly known vulnerability, this was the vulnerability of the Exchange server in hybrid mode, where an attacker with admin access to the Exchange server could attack other parts of the infrastructure, in particular your domain controller. Apparently, the root cause here is a directory traversal issue in Kerberos. And Binary published an interesting report about the XZ-Utils Backdoor. If you remember, this was March last year that this backdoor was discovered. It was a very interesting sort of case about open source security and some interesting social engineering. Luckily back then, the backdoor was found pretty quickly, so there wasn't really any major harm done. At least the harm was somewhat limited. What Binary now found is that this particular XZ-Utils Backdoor is still present in some Docker images that are distributed by the official Docker Debian account. Debian Linux was the distribution affected by this backdoor. That's sort of why this happened. There's some controversy between Binary and the Debian maintainers here, whether or not these affected images should be removed from the Docker hub. Binary's argument is, obviously there's a backdoor in these images, and people typically trust images being distributed by Debian on their official Docker account. Debian's argument is, it's really just a vulnerability like anything else. The affected images are not currently supported images. They're really just maintained sort of for archive purposes. And since this backdoor is really just a vulnerability, they're not going to remove them. And as sort of an example, they pointed out that old versions of Debian that, for example, are suffering from the Heartbleed vulnerability are also still available for download. Overall, of course, most vendors or many vendors make old vulnerable images available for download or software available for download, not just via Docker Hub, but also their official software distribution websites. Sometimes for researchers, this is quite useful to be able to find these old vulnerable software versions if you try to, for example, experiment with a particular exploit. On the other hand, of course, there is sort of this attitude that, hey, if it comes from Docker, it's official, it must be free of malware. And XZ-Utils, that backdoor, certainly, well, qualifies more as malware than a normal vulnerability, even though a CVE number was assigned to it. So lesson learned here, be careful what you download from Docker Hub. Make sure you're downloading currently supported versions of images, not just any image from a trustworthy account. And of course, there's always a chance that things like that will end up in images derived from these vulnerable images. So it's not just that the Debian images are affected, but any images that use them as their base are possibly infected as well. And then we do have two critical vulnerabilities in Fortinet devices. I would rate them sort of as patch now. This first one here is essentially an authentication bypass vulnerability in FortiWeb. There are already proof of concept exploits out there, so assume this being exploited. The second vulnerability, also published yesterday, is a vulnerability in FortiSIEM, and it allows for an unauthenticated OS command injection vulnerability. So both of these critical. Both of these essentially exploit in the wild. Like for the first one, we do have exploit code public. For the second one, the FortiSIEM vulnerability, Fortinet states as part of the advisory that they have found exploit code in the wild taking advantage of this vulnerability. So definitely both of them must patch now. Well, and that's it for today. So thanks for listening and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.